We had a show in Philadelphia on November 25th, my birthday. To celebrate, Layne and I went back to the hotel to get high. We ran into the guys from the rap group House of Pain who were staying in the same hotel. Their single Jump Around was a huge hit at the moment. Lead rapper Everlast was a nice guy, and with a wide smile he invited us to come hang out and party. Before we joined him, we each did a shot of some powerful East Coast white powdered heroin. By the time we got up to Everlast's room, I was in such a heavy nod that I could hardly lift my head off my chest. I remember Layne telling Everlast, "It's cool, he just smoked some great weed, and not much else." While playing a show in Boston 2 days later, I got so drunk that I was like a rag doll on rubber legs. At one point, I found myself on my knees in the crowded dressing room going down on a hot red-haired stripper. Whenever the door opened, a group of audience members could clearly see what I was doing, but I didn't care. Whenever I was drunk, all decorum went directly out the window. On the tour bus driving to Montreal that night, I noticed a slight tightness and heat in the crook of my arm where I had injected the dope in Philly. By the time we arrived in Quebec, my entire arm was swollen twice its normal size, flaming hot, and apple red. My road manager first took me to see a doctor in a seedy medical building. The moment I took off my shirt, the doctor said, "You have to go to the hospital immediately. You have a blood infection. You'll be lucky if you don't lose that arm." Later, on a gurney in the basement hallway of the French-speaking hospital, a doctor hooked me up to IV antibiotics. With a ballpoint pen, he drew a line around the inflamed scarlet area from my shoulder to my wrist and said, "I'm going to come back and check in 12 hours. If the redness has gone outside the line, I'm afraid we're going to have to amputate your arm at the shoulder." At the show that night, Layne got up on stage with the Trees to sing some of my songs in my absence. Afterward, he came to the hospital to see me. He broke down in tears for a minute at the sight of me lying in the hallway with my huge, bright, red, swollen arm. The cute French girl I often hung out with when in Boston had traveled with me on the bus to Canada. She came to see me as well. After speaking to a doctor in their native tongue about my condition, she looked at me with profound sadness and shook her head before also breaking out in tears. I was starting to feel like this might not turn out in my favor. Sleeping that first night was next to impossible, with the constant crying and moaning of the elderly woman in front of me and my mind racing about the possibility of losing my dominant arm from the shoulder down. Late at night, as I was almost asleep, out of the break room directly opposite me in the narrow hallway came a rousing version of Happy Birthday in French. I snapped and yelled, "Shut the fuck up!" The break room door slammed shut. I woke the next morning to something heavy landing on my chest and some hot liquid hitting me in the face. I opened my eyes and saw the large metal orderly who had just dropped a breakfast tray on me, splashing hot coffee in my face. With an evil smile, he leaned down and whispered in a heavy French accent, "Still happy rock and roll?" I was never to get into a room, just a gurney lined up with several others in the subterranean hallway. Every 12 hours for the next 8 days, somebody came by to look at my arm. "It looks like it's getting better. We may be able to let you go tomorrow," one doctor would say. Hours later, a different doctor would say, "If this thing isn't better by tomorrow, we may have to take it off." I tried to console myself with the pitifully small doses of painkillers they gave me, and I became obsessed with getting head from one of the street hookers outside before I lost my arm. My close friend John Hicks, who some people not unfairly referred to as my bag man, was working as a Screaming Trees drum tech, while the rest of the band kept traveling with the tour in case I was released and could rejoin them at some point. Hicks had stayed behind in a flea-bitten motel near the hospital to keep me company. He had been my close friend for years. I'd met him in Seattle, where he'd come from Johnson City, Tennessee, bringing with him the thick, heavy Southern accent many Europeans and even some Americans we'd come across found confounding to decipher. I loved him and his balls-out courage in his role as my surrogate and closest ally. He was one of the first people I'd ever done heroin with, and we traveled together for years. Every day he tried to get a hooker past security with the idea that I would roll my IV stand down the hall to the stairwell to receive one final blowjob as a two-armed person. Much to my consternation, it never happened. The security guard at the door was particularly vigilant and immediately wised up to Hicks's game. In a stagnant fury, I envisioned Hicks in his motel room getting endless rounds of oral sex from the hookers outside, scoring dope for himself and not sharing it with me, while I was laid up in this grimy, soot-covered hallway, amputation imminent, bored to fucking death with sick, elderly French-speaking homeless people as my only companions. Unable to get off their gurneys, most of these unfortunate souls were faced with the indignity of having to shit in bedpans in plain view of everyone else. The whole place constantly stank like a hole-in-the-floor Italian gas station toilet. I thank God I could at least walk to the restroom when I had to. By the end of my stay, Hicks steered clear of me to avoid my wrath at his failure. Finally, the swelling subsided. After 8 days, during which I did nothing but hit up nurses and doctors for painkillers, berate Hicks, and obsess about sex, drugs, and amputation, I was released. Not for one moment did it cross my mind that I had done this to myself. I wasn't built like that. God forbid I should change my way of living. John and I rejoined the band in Cleveland, where he and I spent our first evening back partying with 2 strippers all night in the hotel sauna, which we'd broken into after hours. I eagerly accepted the first blowjob one of them offered, and the next day immediately started shooting dope again. Self-reflection and soul-searching were not in my limited vocabulary.